The morning Margaret Collins walked into Harper and Row Marketing in downtown Chicago, Daniel Harper felt something shift before he even saw her. The email from HR had been simple, just a welcome note for a new senior consultant, but he had read her name 3 times because Margaret Collins was not just a hire, she was his mother-in-law. And as he stood near the glass conference room, watching employees gather for introductions, he told himself it would be fine, that he was a professional, that family and work could stay separate. Yet when she stepped through the doors in a navy blazer with calm confidence and a polite smile, the room seemed smaller, the air tighter, and he suddenly became aware of every unfinished conversation at home with his wife Emily. Margaret greeted the team warmly, shaking hands, making eye contact, speaking clearly about her years of experience in brand strategy. And Daniel noticed how easily people listened to her, how quickly she commanded respect. Without raising her voice, and when her eyes finally met his across the table, there was a flicker of shared awareness, not inappropriate, not dramatic, just the quiet understanding that this arrangement was unusual. He introduced her like any other colleague, keeping his tone steady, explaining the upcoming campaign they would be leading together, and the word together echoed in his mind longer than it should have. The project was important. A national launch for a wellness company targeting families across the Midwest, and deadlines were tight, which meant long meetings, brainstorming sessions, and late evenings refining presentations. And from the first strategy discussion, it was clear that Margaret was sharp, insightful, and unafraid to challenge him. She questioned his tagline choice, suggested a more emotional angle. And when the room grew silent after her comment, Daniel surprised himself by nodding in agreement because she was right, the message needed heart, not just data. As the days moved quickly, their professional rhythm formed almost effortlessly. She would outline big picture ideas while he structured them into clear campaigns. They built slides side by side, their conversations moving fast and focused, and coworkers began to joke lightly about their perfect partnership, which made Daniel smile outwardly, but think inwardly about how different this dynamic felt from his quiet dinners at home, where Emily often seemed tired after hospital shifts, and he often seemed distracted by numbers and targets. At home that week, Emily was excited about her mother's new beginning, asking detailed questions about the office culture, the people, the projects, and Daniel answered carefully, choosing neutral words, saying Margaret was adjusting well, that the team respected her, that the campaign was demanding. He did not mention how she stayed late on Tuesday to help him rewrite a pitch, how they talked about risk and reinvention while the city lights flickered beyond the windows, or how she admitted softly that starting over after divorce, at her age, felt both brave and frightening. He had never heard her speak so openly before, not at family dinners, not during holidays, and hearing that honesty stirred something in him. Not desire exactly, but recognition, because he too felt stuck in routines he never questioned. One rainy evening, when most employees rushed out early, they remained in the quiet office reviewing a budget report, the steady tapping of rain against the glass, creating a private rhythm, and the conversation drifted from numbers to life without either of them planning it. Margaret spoke about the years she spent supporting her former husband's career, while her own ambitions waited quietly, and Daniel found himself admitting that somewhere between promotions and mortgage payments, he had stopped asking what truly excited him. Their voices were low but steady, respectful, thoughtful, and there was no line crossed, only truths shared that perhaps should have been spoken to other people. When they both reached for the same folder and their hands brushed lightly, they pulled back immediately, the moment lasting less than a second yet, carrying more weight than it deserved. Margaret straightened her papers and suggested they call it a night, her tone professional again, and Daniel agreed, grabbing his coat, walking her to the elevator without another word. Driving home through wet streets, he replayed the evening in his mind, searching for evidence of wrongdoing and finding none, yet still feeling unsettled, because nothing dramatic had happened, but something subtle had shifted. A door inside him had opened to a feeling of being understood, and as he entered his quiet house and saw Emily asleep on the couch with the television glowing softly, guilt mixed with confusion settled in his chest. He covered her with a blanket, noticing how peaceful she looked, remembering their early years filled with laughter and late-night talks. And he wondered when those conversations had turned into quick updates about schedules and bills. The next morning at work, he tried to create distance, keeping meetings formal, avoiding unnecessary small talk. But the campaign demanded collaboration, and Margaret remained composed, focused, never referencing the rain-soaked evening, which somehow made it harder, because the unspoken tension hovered gently between them, like static in the air. During a brainstorming session later that week, she presented a revised concept built around emotional connection and second chances. And as she explained the idea, Daniel felt the irony press against him. Second chances were powerful themes, ones that resonated deeply with audiences, ones that perhaps resonated too closely with his own restless thoughts. Co-workers praised the concept, management approved the direction, and the success bound them even tighter as partners on the project. Emails flew late into the night, feedback loops shortened, and gradually Daniel realized he looked forward to her insights, not because they were thrilling or forbidden, but because they were honest and direct. At home, Emily remained unaware of any internal struggle, trusting both her husband and her mother completely, and that trust made Daniel even more determined to keep clear boundaries. Yet emotions do not always follow rules as neatly as calendars do. By the end of the month, the campaign draft was nearly complete, and the team celebrated with casual drinks in the office lounge, laughter filling the space, music playing softly, and as Daniel watched Margaret speaking confidently with younger employees, encouraging them, advising them, he saw her not only as his wife's mother, but as a woman rebuilding herself, strong yet vulnerable. And that layered understanding complicated his thoughts further. When the evening ended and people filtered out into the cool Chicago night, Daniel lingered by the window alone, aware that life had not exploded into scandal. No dramatic confession had taken place. Yet everything felt subtly altered, because proximity had revealed emotional gaps he had ignored for years, and as he turned off the lights and locked his office door, he understood that the real challenge ahead would not be managing a marketing campaign, but managing his own heart before quiet understanding turned into something neither he nor his family could afford. By the time the wellness campaign entered its final phase, Daniel and Margaret had become the center of attention at Harper & Row Marketing, not because of gossip or scandal, but because their ideas kept winning approval. Their presentations felt alive, and clients responded with excitement, and every success pushed them into closer teamwork, more strategy calls, more shared notes, more quiet moments in glass meeting rooms where the city stretched wide beneath them. Daniel tried to stay focused on numbers and timelines, yet he could not ignore how easily conversations with Margaret moved beyond work, how naturally she understood his half-finished thoughts, how she challenged him without making him feel small, and co-workers often smiled and said they worked like two minds on the same track, which made him laugh politely, while inside he felt a strange mix of pride and discomfort. At home, Emily noticed he seemed energized after work, but distant during dinner, and she assumed it was career pressure, asking if the campaign was stressful, and he answered yes because that was partly true, though the real pressure came from emotions he did not fully understand. Margaret sensed it too, the quiet pull forming between them, and she tried to keep conversations strictly professional, speaking about data charts and consumer research. Yet sometimes during late review sessions, silence would settle between them, heavy but unspoken, and Daniel would feel the weight of choices he had not yet made but might soon face. One afternoon, management announced that Daniel and Margaret would travel to New York for a final client pitch, and when he told Emily about the trip, she seemed proud, even encouraging him to celebrate the success with her mother, trusting both of them completely, and that trust made Daniel's chest tighten. The flight to New York was calm, both of them reviewing notes instead of talking about anything personal, but the energy was different from Chicago, unfamiliar streets and bright city lights, making everything feel slightly removed from normal life. The client meeting the next morning went smoothly. Margaret delivered a strong opening, Daniel closed with confidence, and applause followed, sealing the campaign's approval, and afterward they stepped into a quiet cafe near the office building to decompress before heading to the airport. The space was warm, soft music playing in the background, rain tapping lightly against the window, and for the first time since arriving, the conversation slowed. No laptops open, no slides to review, just two people sitting across from each other. Margaret spoke first, her tone thoughtful, saying success felt good, but also complicated. That starting a new chapter in her life had forced her to question old regrets, and Daniel listened carefully, sensing deeper meaning in her words. She admitted that working closely with him had reminded her what partnership could feel like when two people truly listen, and though she did not say anything improper, the honesty in her voice made his pulse quicken because he felt the same recognition. He responded carefully, saying he respected her greatly, that their teamwork had helped him rediscover parts of himself he thought were gone: ambition, creativity, purpose. And as their eyes met across the table, something silent passed between them. Not physical, not dramatic, but clear. Margaret leaned back and took a slow breath, then gently said that emotional closeness can grow quietly if people are not careful, and that sometimes what feels like understanding can turn into something heavier, and Daniel realized she was drawing a boundary with grace before either of them stepped too far. The truth settled over them both. They were not reckless teenagers. They were adults with responsibilities, with family bonds that mattered, and the very fact that they could speak about the tension openly meant they still had control. On the flight home, they kept conversation light, discussing future projects and next quarter goals, but inside Daniel felt shaken, not because of what happened, but because of what almost could. And when he walked through his front door that evening and saw Emily waiting with a tired but loving smile, he understood the fragile balance he stood upon. Over the following days, he tried to create distance at the office, delegating tasks to other team members, shortening meetings, keeping communication formal, and Margaret supported this shift without complaint, focusing more on independent assignments. Yet success kept pulling them back together, as leadership praised their partnership and assigned them another high-profile account. Whispers began around the office, harmless at first, colleagues joking about their power duo. But even innocent comments can fuel suspicion, and one evening, when Emily stopped by unexpectedly with homemade dinner to surprise them after a late meeting, she saw Daniel and Margaret standing close over a desk reviewing printed drafts, their shoulders nearly touching, their expressions focused and soft. Nothing inappropriate was happening. The door was open, the lights bright, papers scattered across the table. Yet something in Daniel's face changed when he noticed Emily at the doorway. A flicker of guilt he could not hide quickly enough. Emily's smile wavered just slightly, her eyes moving between her husband and her mother, reading the room in a way only someone deeply connected could. And though she said nothing sharp, the atmosphere shifted instantly. They all ate together in strained politeness, conversation careful and measured. And after Margaret left, early citing fatigue, Emily drove home quietly with Daniel, her silence heavier than anger. That night she asked simple questions: whether the trip went well, whether working together was comfortable. And Daniel answered truthfully that it was productive and professional, but his hesitation spoke louder than his words. Emily did not accuse him of anything dramatic. She simply said she felt something was different. That emotional distance can appear before actions do, and her calm honesty unsettled him more than shouting ever could. Lying awake later, Daniel replayed the cafe conversation in New York, Margaret's gentle warning about closeness growing unnoticed, and he realized she had been right, that the danger was not in scandal or sudden romance, but in subtle emotional shifts that slowly redraw boundaries. The next morning at the office, he found Margaret already at her desk, reviewing reports with steady focus, and when their eyes met, there was mutual understanding that something had to change. They agreed quietly to adjust their workflow, involve more team members, and keep personal reflections out of professional space, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because prevention mattered. Yet even as they created distance, Daniel sensed the ripple effect had already begun at home. Emily's trust slightly shaken, his own heart divided between loyalty and longing for connection, and the campaign's success felt hollow compared to the emotional cost building beneath it. Part 2, closed not with a confession or scandal, but with a fragile realization that emotional lines, once blurred, cannot be unseen, and the true test would not be resisting temptation in obvious moments, but repairing the quiet fractures already forming within his marriage before they widened beyond repair. The tension that had been building quietly finally reached its breaking point on a cold Thursday evening when Emily sat across from Daniel at their kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of untouched tea, her eyes steady but wounded. And instead of shouting or accusing, she asked one simple question that cut deeper than anger ever could. She asked whether his heart was still fully in their marriage. And Daniel felt the weight of weeks of emotional confusion pressed down on him all at once, because he knew this moment was not about rumors or office gossip, but about distance, about the subtle shift she had sensed long before he admitted it to himself. He tried to explain that nothing inappropriate had happened, that he had not crossed a physical line, but even as he spoke, he understood that emotional closeness can hurt just as much. And Emily listened quietly, tears forming, not from betrayal of action, but from betrayal of attention, because she felt him drifting away long before she saw it in that office doorway. She admitted she felt replaced in small ways, that their conversations had grown shorter while his stories about work had grown brighter, that he seemed alive discussing projects yet distracted at dinner. And Daniel realized that the real damage was not romance, but neglect, not scandal, but silence. Meanwhile, Margaret felt the same storm rising from a different place. She saw the strain in Emily's voice during phone calls, sensed the careful tone Daniel used in meetings, and she carried a growing guilt that kept her awake at night because the last thing she ever wanted was to stand between her daughter and her marriage. One afternoon, she requested a private conversation with Daniel in his office, the door slightly open, the space professional but heavy with meaning, and she spoke first with calm honesty, saying that whatever had formed between them was rooted in shared understanding, not wrongdoing. Yet even understanding can become dangerous if it replaces communication where it truly belongs. Daniel did not argue. He admitted he had leaned into their partnership because it filled emotional gaps he had ignored at home, and saying it out loud made him face an uncomfortable truth that the issue was not Margaret, but his own failure to nurture his marriage. Margaret's eyes softened, but remained firm as she told him that love is a choice made daily, not a feeling that simply appears in the right company, and that if he valued Emily, he needed to step back completely before confusion turned into regret. That same evening, she made a decision that surprised him. She requested a transfer to the company's Seattle branch, presenting it as a career opportunity, and leadership approved quickly because her skills were in demand. When she informed Emily, she framed it as growth, as a chance to build something new in a different city, and though Emily sensed deeper reasons, she chose grace over suspicion, hugging her mother tightly and wishing her well. The days leading to Margaret's departure were filled with quiet finality, meetings reassigned, projects redistributed, conversations strictly professional, and Daniel felt both relief and sadness, because stepping back meant losing the connection that had sparked his creative fire, yet also protecting the life he had built. On Margaret's last afternoon in Chicago, she stopped by his office one final time, sunlight spilling through the windows, casting long shadows across the desk where so many ideas had been born, and without dramatic gestures or lingering looks, she thanked him for the collaboration, saying it reminded her that starting over was possible at any age, but she also reminded him that emotional honesty must begin at home. And Daniel nodded, understanding that this goodbye was not about lost romance, but about choosing responsibility. After she left, the office felt quieter, almost ordinary again. Yet at home, the real work was just beginning, because removing the source of tension did not automatically repair the cracks already exposed. Emily and Daniel began attending counseling sessions together, sitting side by side on a small couch in a softly lit room where they were asked uncomfortable questions about communication, expectations, and unspoken disappointments. And for the first time in years, they spoke openly about how routine had replaced romance, how stress had replaced curiosity, how they had slowly stopped seeing each other as evolving individuals. Daniel admitted he had sought validation in his professional success because it felt easier than confronting emotional distance at home, and Emily admitted she had withdrawn into work and exhaustion without expressing her need for connection. And though the conversations were raw, they were not cruel. There was no blame thrown like weapons, only shared accountability. Nights that once passed in silence were now filled with deliberate effort, small gestures of kindness, honest check-ins about feelings, and gradual rebuilding of trust that had been shaken but not shattered. Daniel deleted late-night work emails from his phone, set boundaries around office hours, and made time for simple rituals like morning coffee together or evening walks around their neighborhood. And Emily noticed the shift not because he made grand promises, but because he showed up consistently. In Seattle, Margaret began her new role with quiet determination, joining community groups, building friendships, rediscovering hobbies she had long set aside, and distance allowed her to reflect without guilt, understanding that what she and Daniel shared was less about forbidden love and more about two adults recognizing emotional hunger in each other. As weeks turned into months, the sharp ache of tension softened into clarity. Daniel no longer felt pulled between loyalty and longing, because he realized that longing often points to what is missing rather than who is available. And instead of seeking understanding elsewhere, he chose to build it intentionally with his wife. One quiet Sunday afternoon, as autumn leaves drifted across their backyard, Emily rested her head against his shoulder and spoke softly about how close they had come to losing something precious without a single dramatic act, and Daniel held her hand firmly, knowing that sometimes the greatest turning points happen not through scandal, but through realization. Part 3 ended not with destruction, but with decision, not with broken vows, but with renewed commitment, proving that emotional storms can either tear a marriage apart or force it to grow stronger, depending on the courage of those inside it. Winter faded slowly in Chicago, and with it, the heavy tension that had once filled Daniel and Emily's home began to lift, not suddenly, not magically, but through steady effort and honest change, because Part 4 was not about dramatic reunions or grand romantic speeches. It was about quiet rebuilding, about choosing each other in small ways every single day. After Margaret moved to Seattle, distance created clarity for everyone, and Daniel focused on restoring what had nearly slipped through his fingers. He adjusted his schedule to leave the office earlier, stopped bringing work home unnecessarily, and made space for conversations that were not about bills or deadlines, but about feelings, dreams, fears, and the parts of themselves they had ignored for years. Emily, still healing, did not offer instant forgiveness, wrapped in perfect trust. Instead, she asked questions when she felt insecure. She spoke up when distance crept in, and she allowed vulnerability to replace silent resentment, which was harder but healthier. Their counseling sessions continued, each week peeling back another layer of routine that had covered their marriage, and Daniel began to understand that emotional neglect rarely announces itself loudly. It grows quietly in busy schedules and tired evenings, and if left unchecked, it can push people toward connections that feel new simply because they feel attentive. He admitted openly that working closely with Margaret had awakened parts of him he thought were gone: creativity, ambition, emotional depth. But instead of chasing that feeling outside his marriage, he chose to cultivate it inside, inviting Emily into brainstorming ideas, asking her opinions on campaigns, listening with the same focus he once gave to late office meetings. Emily responded gradually, sharing stories from the hospital, letting him see her stress instead of hiding it behind strength, and slowly laughter returned to their kitchen. Not forced, not fragile, but natural. Meanwhile, in Seattle, Margaret rebuilt her own life with intention. She joined a local marketing association, made friends her own age, and enrolled in a weekend photography class she had once postponed for decades, and in her quiet apartment overlooking the rainy streets, she reflected without regret, understanding that what happened in Chicago had been a warning, not a scandal, a reminder that emotional lines must be guarded with wisdom. She called Emily often, their conversations warm and open. And though there was an unspoken history between them, they chose grace over suspicion, because family bonds were stronger than temporary confusion. Back in Chicago, Daniel faced another challenge when leadership offered him a promotion that would require even longer hours, and months earlier he would have accepted immediately, but this time he paused, discussing it fully with Emily, weighing ambition against balance, and together they decided he would accept with clear boundaries, proving that growth does not mean sacrificing connection. Co-workers noticed he seemed calmer, more focused, less restless, and though no one knew the full story, they sensed maturity in his leadership, because he now valued teamwork not just for results, but for healthy collaboration. One evening, months after Margaret's departure, Emily found an old photo album from their early years, and as they flipped through pictures of road trips, first apartments, and simple smiles, Daniel felt a deep ache of gratitude that they had not let pride or silence destroy something worth fighting for. He apologized again, not for an affair that never happened, but for drifting emotionally, and Emily accepted, not because the pain had vanished, but because the effort had proven real. Spring arrived with lighter air and longer days, and with it came small celebrations, a weekend getaway to a lakeside cabin, dinners cooked together, music playing softly in the background, and moments where eye contact lasted just a little longer, reminding them that romance is not built on intensity alone, but on consistent care. Daniel understood now that attraction can grow in places where attention flows, and if he wanted his marriage to thrive, he had to keep that attention alive at home. Margaret visited Chicago briefly during the summer for a corporate conference, and the reunion was warm but measured. Hugs exchanged in a busy hotel lobby, conversations about projects and new hobbies, no lingering tension, only respectful distance and quiet understanding that the storm had passed. Emily joined them for dinner that evening, and the three of them laughed gently over shared memories, the atmosphere lighter than it had been in years, because truth had replaced secrecy and choice had replaced confusion. As the night ended and they parted ways, Daniel felt no pull of divided loyalty, only gratitude for lessons learned before damage became irreversible. Months turned into a year, and the story that once threatened to fracture a family became instead a turning point that strengthened it. Because sometimes what feels like temptation is actually a signal that something important needs attention, and when faced with that signal, Daniel chose responsibility over impulse. On a quiet anniversary evening, sitting on their back porch under soft string lights, Emily leaned against him and said she was proud of the work they had done. And he realized that love in adulthood is less about dramatic passion and more about daily commitment, about noticing when distance grows and stepping toward each other instead of away. Everything had changed after Margaret started working at his office, not because of betrayal, but because hidden cracks were exposed to the light. And in that light, Daniel and Emily rebuilt something stronger than before, proving that emotional storms can either pull people apart or teach them how to hold on tighter, and in their case, they chose to hold on.